Hello, welcome to the Pawsitive Post in Conversation, the show about how to have a better relationship with your dog and cat. I'm Zazie Todd, author of the books Wag and Purr and creator of companion animal psychology blog. My co-host Kristi Benson is a dog trainer and anthropologist, and she also works for the Academy for Dog Trainers. We don't give advice on your pet, so if you have concerns, see your veterinarian, dog trainer or cat behaviourist as appropriate. Thanks for joining us today. In this episode, we're joined by zoologist Dr. Jo Wimpenny to talk about her book Aesop's Animals, The Science Behind the Fables, and whether there's any truth in what our favourite childhood stories say about animal minds. Hi everybody, welcome to the Pawsitive Post in Conversation. I'm Zazie Todd. I'm joined as always by my friend and colleague Kristi Benson. Hi Kristi.
Hello.
And today we have a very special guest whose book I absolutely love. So we're talking to Dr. Jo Wimpenny. Jo Wimpenny is a zoologist and writer with a research background in animal behaviour and the history of science. She studied zoology at the University of Bristol and went on to research problem solving in crows for her DPhil at Oxford University. After postdoctoral research on the history of ornithology at Sheffield, she co-authored the book 10,000 Birds, Ornithology Since Darwin with Tim Birkhead and Bob Montgomery, which won the 2015 Prose Award for the History of Science, Medicine and Technology, which is fantastic. And she's the author of an absolutely wonderful book called Aesop's Animals, which we'll be talking about today. And the book club read this book a little while back, and it's just wonderful. It's this really wonderful idea, and it's beautifully, beautifully done. So you take a set of fables from Aesop and you explore the extent to which they're true and what modern science can tell us about the animals in those fables. And it's just a wonderful story all the way through, and it's a brilliant read, and I absolutely loved it. So thank you very much for coming to chat to us about it today.
Oh, thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having me. It's really good to be here.
It's our pleasure. So first of all, how did you come up with the idea to compare Aesop's fables with what we know about animals?
Yeah, so as you said, I did my PhD on crow cognition. So that was at Oxford, and it was soon after I finished that this pivotal study was published on rooks, which was the first demonstration of, the first replication really of an Aesop's fable. So it was the fable of the crow and the pitcher, which I can just expand slightly. I'm sure your listeners are familiar, but there's a very thirsty crow that comes across a pitcher with water in it, but it can't reach the water because it can't get its head inside the neck of the pitcher. So what it does is it drops stones into the pitcher, and little by little it brings up the water level, and so it can drink. So it saves itself from dying of thirst by this amazing problem-solving feat. And so this experiment was replicated in, I think, 2009. At the University of Cambridge, and they did it with rooks, which are another kind of corvid, so a member of the crow family, and they found that the rooks did it. And so I'd sort of just come out of my PhD, and I was quite struck by this experiment, and it wasn't immediate, but it so proceeds for this idea of, I wonder which other fables might actually be supported by science, and so the idea was kind of born out of that. Was a bit of a slow burner. But, I spent years worrying that somebody else was going to write all about it before I sort of got my arse in gear and actually did it.
Well, thankfully they didn't, and you got to do it. And these are very old fables, aren't they? They're from such a long time ago. So to think about them now in terms of modern science is a really interesting idea. But because they're part of our cultural history, did you grow up with a copy of Aesop's Fables?
I don't even remember. And I'd love for it to be the case that I fondly remember listening, to my parents reading Aesop's Fables. I was definitely familiar with them. I'm sure we probably had a copy. And yeah, what you say about them being really old stories, they date back, well, we don't know that much about Aesop, but current sort of idea is that he lived some 500 to 600 years BC. So, if he produced these fables, and we know that several of them will have been added to, and they've sort of evolved over the years, but we're still looking at over 2,000-year-old stories. And so the thing that struck me was just how amazing, how bizarre actually it is that we still tell these stories that are so old, and that our beliefs about certain animals are still influenced by these stories that are, we've moved on in so many ways in our society, but these things still influence us from such an early age. And so that was one of my main motivations and things that I wanted to explore in the book.
I think it's such a great hook too, like, because everybody is exposed to these stories, you really know them. And I think, your point was really good in the book, that these aren't stories about animals per se. They're stories about teaching about human morality, and human society and human behavior and how humans should act, but because it's animals, it becomes, like it becomes a part of our sort of like the fabric of how we think about animals was sort of set up in these stories. So it was really neat. I thought it was a great hook to be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I didn't realize that I thought that way about animals because of this story that I heard. And we didn't have a copy in my house when I was a kid, but I think we read them in like, I don't know, grade 5 or something. I remember checking them out of the library and reading them and, finding them really satisfying as a kid, there's something so satisfying about those stories. So yeah, I think your writing also is great. I think you do a really good job of taking the science and making it interesting but not dumbed down, which I don't think the book would have had the legs it has without your writing, as well as the hook of just being like, oh God, these stories are so familiar to us.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's exactly what I wanted to achieve, really. It's stories about science, and science had to be at the heart of them. I didn't want to trivialize what we know, because some of the science is so complicated. So there's a lot in that book. There are a lot of findings, and that's a remarkable testimony, really, to the way that the field of animal cognition and everything that we know about animal behaviour has really grown. But it's great to hear that you like the writing style. That's good. Thanks.
Yeah. So in one of the chapters, The Dog and Its Shadow, it takes the starting point of the question of whether dogs can recognize themselves in a mirror. And as well as answering this question, you look at what a dog-centered approach to addressing this question might be. So can you talk us through that?
Sure. So in the fable, there's a dog. It's got this lovely juicy bone, and it's hurrying home, and it goes across the bridge over a river or a lake or something, and it sees its reflection. And in the fable, it doesn't recognize that the reflection is itself. It sees another dog, and so it does what dogs do, and it barks at the other dog, and therefore drops his bone into the water and loses it. And so I saw this as a really nice way of getting into the topic of self-awareness and mirror self-recognition. And that's a topic that has some controversy to it. So classically, the way that people would ask whether animals are self-aware, or, whether they can realize that they're looking at themselves rather than another animal, would be to use the mirror test and the mirror self-recognition test, which was pioneered by Gordon Gallup with chimpanzees back in the early 1970s. And that test has sort of very much become the gold standard test for asking whether animals are self-aware. But for things like dogs and lots of other animals, they don't pass it. So in that respect, Aesop was quite right in the fable, in that, and you can see this from YouTube, I'm sure, and I'm sure lots of your listeners will have seen this in their dogs as well, that if they stand in front of a mirror, they're more likely to bark at the reflection, or they're more likely to try and initiate play with it, or maybe they'll just ignore it. But there's
or look behind.
Yeah, there's no evidence that they look in the mirror and say, "Oh, that's me," and I need to get this thing off my face, or whatever it is. And so the classic interpretation of animals that fail that test is that they aren't self-aware. But quite a lot of people have called that interpretation into question. So I said it's perhaps not as black and white as that. And rather than saying we can only get information about self-awareness from animals that pass it, we need to really be asking, what does it mean if animals don't pass it? Can we really say that means they've got no self-awareness? And so it was people like Mark Bekoff and Alexandra Horowitz who pioneered these studies with dogs, taking a very different approach. And they decided, they thought it made a lot more sense to ask what the dog knows through its sense of smell, because sense of smell is so very important to dogs. And so much of their kind of recognition is done through their nose rather than through their eyes, that ecologically it makes sense that they might actually recognize other animals and recognize themselves through what they're smelling. So they pioneered these tests. Mark Beckhoff initially did a test called the yellow snow test, and he just sort of tried this out with his own dog, and noticed that when he was out walking in the snow with his dog, if he moved his dog's urine further down the path while his dog was off, in the bushes sniffing around, the dog would come back and actually pay attention to that patch of urine. And if he moved the urine of other dogs as well, he could see these differences in the way that it was sniffing at its urine versus others. And then Alexandra Horowitz took this into the lab and did more experiments on asking whether dogs have this olfactory sense of self. And the evidence seems to be that, yes, they might well recognize themselves based on what they're smelling rather than what they're seeing in a mirror.
Very cool. I think that's very, very cool. So is there a fable that got things completely, absolutely completely wrong when it comes to animals?
I would say the wolf, but I would say every story pretty much that we ever hear about wolves is pretty much wrong. I mean, people are now starting to write stories which portray wolves quite nicely, I think. But, the classic big bad wolf, the wolf in sheep's clothing. So that is the Aesop's fable, is the wolf in sheep's clothing. But there were lots of Aesop's fables about wolves. And in every single one, pretty much, the wolf is portrayed as this ruthless, deceptive, vicious killer, often a lone animal, which, plots to do nasty things. And that's the portrayal, I think, that has been continued over the generations and been laid down into our children's stories, and things like Little Red Riding Hood or Peter and the Wolf or Three Little Pigs. There are so many children's stories that portray wolves as these big bad villains, and it's just not true. I mean, one of my main objections to that is what we even mean by the word villain when we apply it to animals, because that's a very human word. And of course, these fables were about conveying human morality. And so lots of those portrayals are tied up in very human language. But a wolf isn't a villain because that's a label that brings with it lots and lots of human baggage, I think. And it's the same for something like the fox. If we call it, a trickster or cunning or any of these things, which kind of implies that they're doing things in this nasty way and they're plotting to deceive us. So I was very happy to try and shoot down that myth, I suppose, and portray some of the true characteristics of wolves in that particular chapter.
I think one of the favorite sort of ways of conceptualizing animals that I've learned. So I do a lot of work. I'm an anthropologist and I do a lot of work with Indigenous communities here in Canada. And one of the ways that they talk about how animals behave is they use this sort of catchphrase of make a living. So instead of implying these or sort of imposing these moral statements and human labels, which they do too as well, to a lesser extent, but they just, if you say, well, what's that animal doing? There'll often be this coming back of he's just making a living in the world, so just having that, which I love that sort of way of thinking about it, because we're just making a living in our world too. And then animals are just making a living in their world. So I love that as sort of like a better reframe of what are the wolves doing, making a living.
Yeah. I really like that. I think we really need to move away from just putting all of these labels and this, like I said, this baggage on other animals, and just thinking of them as little furry or scaly or whatever, feathered little people. We are the center of, we're the center of the human world, but we're not the center of many of these animals' worlds. We don't feature in their worlds. No, to the extent that we probably assume that we do.
And it seems like behavior that we would carry out while we were making our own living is judged differently if an animal does the same thing. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, how dare the wolf eat an animal, when a lot of people eat animals too, so.
Yeah.
If you got wolves who are like getting it wrong? Is there a fable where you think, wow, mostly Aesop got it right when it comes to animal behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I've already talked through the crow fable, which would be the classic one where he totally got it right. And it's now sort of taken off as a whole research paradigm in animal cognition, which is very cool that Aesop's fable kind of sparked that as a way of investigating problem solving. So there are other fables where Aesop got it right, but I guess part of my aim with the book was to try and go a little bit further than just, was it the same, do the fables support what we see in nature, for example? Because say if you look at something like the ants and grasshopper, to an extent, that is sort of borne out by the evidence. Lots of ants do store up grain over the summer, and they store it in granaries, and that lasts them through the winter. And grasshoppers don't do that. So on the surface of it, that fable would be supported by what we see. But if you go a little bit deeper and ask about whether that behaviour is truly borne out in the terms of the cognitive processes that are going on, then that's a really different question. So the ants in Aesop's fable are projecting themselves forward mentally into the future. They're doing what we call mental time travel. They're anticipating what's going to happen over the winter and the fact that they're going to need to store up food, and they're sort of consciously doing that. They're storing that for that reason. And that's not at all what happens in nature,
Right.
So it's kind of like on the surface, yes, some of the fables match up, but take a step deeper and things get a lot more complicated.
Right.
And I suppose that's the same with the dog and the shadow as well. On the surface, yes, the dog didn't recognize itself, but what does that actually tell us about dogs' self-awareness? We need to go a little bit deeper to actually look into that more.
And I love that you have all these different animals in the book, because I think sometimes when people are thinking about animals, they're not thinking about ants and grasshoppers. They're thinking about dogs and wolves maybe, but not so much about insects. So that's really interesting that they got to be included as well, I think. And so what is the main message that you think you would like people to take from the book when they read the book?
I think it's to think of animals as animals overwhelmingly. It's to move away from villainizing or, venerating animals for things that are built on human abilities, and just to see animals for what they really are, because the truth of what they can do and why they do what they do is so much more interesting. If we just think of them as these kind of one-dimensional characters, which are villainous or cunning or, dumb donkey or whatever it is, we're losing so much. And I think that's such a shame. I think the truth is so much richer if we actually look into what the science can tell us.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think in one of our last conversations, we spoke with someone who wrote fiction, and she brought dogs in, and they were often like big characters in the novels. She's writing romance novels, and there was like a veterinarian, and so she had these dogs who were like a big character. And I asked her, like, how can you talk about dogs? And because she's a dog trainer too, how can you not just moralize about them and be like, because I would find it really hard to write about dogs and not be like, oh, and you should pick up your dog's poop, and you should stop treating your dog like that. Like, it would be hard for me not to try and educate. And I asked her, how do you get away from that? How do you actually pull it off so well? And she said she treats the dog, she makes sure that she always treats the dog like it's a real character, like it's its own beast. And I feel like that's kind of the dog, like animals are their own creatures. They have their own motivations, and they're in their own ecological niche, and they they're doing what they need to do. So I thought that was just like a cool sort of I feel like I'm hearing that again from you. Like, animals we need to see them for who they are, not.
Yeah, totally. And they are really, they're characters in their own stories, I suppose. And I just think it's a bit of arrogance in the human species, I think sometimes, where we sort of put ourselves at, and we assume that we're at the center of all of it. And, you know, these animals are doing, exactly. They're making a living, or they're doing what they need to do. And particularly, we've made life so much harder for so many animals. We're in this catastrophic world at the moment for biodiversity, and animals are just trying to get by in a world that we have made so hostile in so many ways. I just think it's such a shame to then put these moral labels on them, and to sort of castigate them for things that are built on ancient stories. I mean, to me, you know, sometimes when I think about it like that, it just seems like such a bizarre thing to be doing.
I think that sort of leads us into my next question, which is about sort of myth busting as dog trainers. So as dog trainers, a lot of times when we go into someone's house and we're helping them with their dog, people have these mythologies, you know, these fables, I guess, about their dogs. And a lot of times it's based on the misunderstanding of wolf behavior, which I think you do a nice job of deconstructing in the book. Or it's this morality. Like people will say, well, whenever I leave my house, my dog is angry at me, or is like has this like feel of iniquity, you know, like she's getting back at me because I left her alone. Or so people have all of these, they sort of ascribe all of these human cognitive processes and emotions and stuff on animals, which make them misbehave when they're really not, you know, like typically the animal is just bored or is upset or what have you. Right. So, and I feel like so having to deconstruct those myths, sometimes we have to get to move forward with our dog training clients, and sometimes we can sort of dance around them, depending on what's exactly going on. So I guess I feel like you're doing this in the book too. You're trying to take these, like literally take these myths and deconstruct them when it comes. So I guess sort of, you know, how do you handle deconstructing myths to people who you're trying to teach? You know, you're teaching people about animal behavior. How do you go about deconstructing myths? Like what do you do for that? I know it's kind of a big question, but if anything comes to mind.
I mean, it's really hard. It's really hard because just nudging people out of firmly held beliefs is, especially ones that have kind of been implanted as a child, and then are continually reinforced through the films they see or the books they read, or, you know, all of the other stories that they're hearing. And facts alone rarely work, you know, facts on their own aren't often enough to change people's minds or to change their behavior. So, you know, I think it's got to be done through storytelling, and it's got to be done through things that are familiar. And that's one of the reasons that you picked up on, Kristi, about using Aesop's fables as a really nice hook, because everyone probably, you know, knows at least one or a few of Aesop's fables. And I think it's by kind of just teasing them apart in a gentle way, maybe, you know, not sort of going in and saying your beliefs are rubbish and you need to like rethink this entire belief system that you've grown up with, but just encouraging people to do a little bit of their own research in a way, like actually pay attention to this animal next time you see a crow or something. And just ask yourself a few questions, and just challenge yourself on what is actually going on. Because I think that's the way that hopefully we can like try and get people to rethink what's going on. I didn't want to bombard people with just facts. That's not an encyclopedia, because that's not going to work. So I don't know if I'm answering your question at all.
No, you are, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, but it's still hard. It's still really hard. And I think the older that the audience gets, probably, and the more firmly held those beliefs are, it's even harder. So I need to write a children's version of this.
That would be a great thing.
Cool. Yes, you totally should.
Yeah, and I mean, quite a few animal books do end up becoming or having a young readers edition too. So, you know, I'm surprised your publisher hasn't already asked you that if they're listening to this, they should ask you to do it, because I think it would be really, really popular, especially because, I mean, children probably are the main people who read Aesop's animals. I mean, as adults, you don't tend to go back to them. You remember them from your childhood. But so I think that would be a really, really nice idea too, to go with this. It would be a great companion.
For sure.
Yeah.
And both in like the exact same thing that you're doing in this book, which is like sort of deconstructing or looking at the science. Could this actually be true? But also like rewriting some symbols so that they actually they have that same morality element or something, or they have that same instructive that's so satisfying, but they don't get the animal behavior stuff wrong.
Yeah, totally. I do think it's time for some new fables. It's time.
Yeah, definitely.
We're in a very different world.
Yeah. Well, this is a wonderful book. It's Aesop's Animals, The Science Behind the Fables. So it's out now in hardback, and the paperback is coming out at the end of October in the UK, and I think you said January in North America. So
yeah.
That's great.
It's available on audiobook, and it's lovely. So if anybody is an audiobook listener like me, that's how I consumed it.
Yes, highly recommended. It's a fantastic book, such a great read. Thank you. So we're going to move on to the section where we talk about other people's books. And we're going to start with you, Jo. And if you can tell us about a book that you've read recently or started recently that you're enjoying. I think you've actually got more than one book to tell us about. So I'm looking forward to hearing what those are.
Yeah, I've got a couple of books actually. I try and balance fiction reading with nonfiction. I just think it's really good to have both. So right now, I've just started, and I'm well behind the times because this came out last year, but I've just started Lucy Cook's Bitch. Oops, Daisy. There we go. I don't know if either of you've read it, but
yeah, I loved it.
I am loving it so far. I just think she's such a good science communicator. And it's just written in a really captivating way. So yeah, she's a fantastic writer. She's sort of expelling all of the myths that have been laid down about male superiority, really, in science, and the idea that female animals are these sort of boring, meek, dull creatures and all the interesting stuff happens in the males of the species. So that's one that I'm loving. And then on the fictional side, although it's actually a little bit not completely fiction. It's it's called Venomous Lumpsucker, which is a great name by Ned Bowman. I don't know if either of you come across this one.
No.
I would really recommend it. It's like a sort of satirical exploration of extinction, which doesn't sound fun. but it is funny, and it's written in a fantastic way, sort of in this dystopian future where everything's gone to crap, and there's an actual sort of business of extinction where people can trade extinction credits. So like a big mining company could spend credits to do what it wants, and some animal will go extinct. So it's kind of like it's exploring the topic of extinction through this venomous lumpsucker fish, which it sounds bizarre. I'm really enjoying it. So I would totally recommend it because it is funny and it is interesting, and there's actually quite a lot of science in it as well. Do you want my third, or have I
go on? No, let's have it.
It's the third one, which is the book that right now I'm just putting in my bag whenever I go somewhere, because I'm trying not to scroll on my phone if I'm waiting for something, or like if I'm on the bus or something. It's Surfacing by Kathleen Jamie, who I love. She's a Scottish poet and writer. She's the national poet of Scotland, actually. And her words are just absolutely beautiful. And she writes these essays about nature and observing and places. And they're just beautiful. She's like a master craftsman of prose, I would say. So there we go. I'll stop talking.
Brilliant. Thank you. 3 great choices. Thanks for sharing them with us. Kristi, what are you reading at the moment?
Okay, so I'm listening to, see if I can make it. I'm not sure if I can make it show up.
I can't read it from here.
Anyway, it's called Being Mortal, and it's written by Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon. And I read and listened to some of his other books and love him as an author. But the subtitle of this book is Medicine and What Matters in the End. And it's sort of like a like a narrative and medical approach to death and dying from the medical perspective. And it's sort of, he uses his, like, sort of the backbone of his dad having cancer and passing away as kind of like the backbone of the book. And then he explores how medicine handles dying and how they talk about it and how they treat it and how it sounds like it would be really morbid, but it's not. It's actually super beautiful and almost like releases you. And I feel like every chapter I get through, I feel a little bit better about, the people in my life who have passed away, or my own, fears of mortality or whatever. I don't know. So I would definitely recommend it. I think if you're close to someone who's dying, it's probably not the book for you right now. But if you happen to have a little bubble of space, I mean, it's gorgeously written and it just has so much fascinating information that is, I think you can really turn it around and sort of feel better about yourself and your own grieving and everything. So I'm loving it. 2 thumbs up, despite it being morbid.
Good. Sounds like a very good book. So what I am reading is Before and After the Book Deal by Courtney Moore. So obviously this is not a book aimed at me, but I wanted to read it anyway and see what it's like. So it's for people who are trying to get a book deal, and it takes them through what they need to do in order to get a book deal. And then that's the first part of the book. And the second part, it takes them beyond that through the process of getting published and what that's like at different kinds of publishers and what you have to do for marketing and publicity and so on. So it's actually packed full of advice. If someone is trying to get an agent or trying to get a book deal, I would really recommend this book. It's full of useful information from a wide range of different people, and it's got things in it that people don't often talk about very much. So it has numbers for how many copies you would like your book to sell, depending on the kind of publisher you're with and that kind of thing. So it does feel like it's a really straightforward guide to all the things that you need to know if you want to bring a book into the world. And so I think, for someone who is trying to get a book deal, it's actually a really excellent book. And it's funny as well, reading through it. It's really well written in the way that it's written. So like I said, not aimed at me, obviously, and I'm very lucky with an amazing agent and an amazing publisher. But I think for someone trying to get a book, and it includes And Surviving at the end, it's a writer's guide to finishing, publishing, promoting and surviving your first book. And I think there are moments when it's hard. However well everything goes, everyone has moments when it's just a really hard process too, and it takes you through the hard times as well as the good times of trying to get your book out there. So I found it a really good read. Great. So that brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Jo. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you, and it was such a pleasure to read your book. If people want to know more about you, like, where do they go? Where's your website and your social media?
Oh, so I have a website, which is just jowimpenny.com. Social media, I'm on Twitter, but less now because to be honest, I was just starting to build up like a presence, and then all of this happened. So I don't know where to channel my social media stuff. So I am on Twitter, and it's at Jo Wimpenny. I'm also on Instagram, and that tends to be where I'm just posting all of my kind of nature loving random animal things. Also at Jo Wimpenny, probably a bit more active on there. But yes, you can find me in either of those places.
Great. Thank you. So the book was Aesop's Animals. We hope everyone enjoys this interview, and you'll definitely love the book. And if you've enjoyed this, then please also make sure to hit the subscribe button so that you always catch future episodes when they're out. Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you for listening to the Pawsitive Post in Conversation. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the show and write us a review via your podcast app. For the show notes, visit companionanimalpsychology.com. This show was produced by Zazie Todd. The music is Melody from Paris by Studio Le Bousse. See you next time.